Hello, everyone. Let's roll some credits. Sorry, I don't have any spectacular sound yet. We're still on the, but here's Peter's nifty steampunkish WordPress.com time travel machinery thingy that leads us to our exciting world of the Troubles in Paradise logo that he came up with. Peter does really spectacular stuff. Now we will stop our screen sharing and put our ugly mugs up on the screen. I have Jackson with me today. We're going to be discussing the wonderful world of some cutting-edge human evolution stuff. Graecopithecus, I'm probably mangling the name there. He's much better at the terms than I am. And also another one on some Chinese fossil finds that popped up. I'd like to thank Lord Crocosquirrel for suggesting this topic. It was particularly on the Graecopithecus thing. And it was hot in my mind because Gunter Bechly, the intelligent design paleontologist in residence, who helped come on the field after Casey Luskin imploded a couple of years ago, has been railing on about human evolution and has picked up on some of these little topics. Summary of what the hell we're talking about here, and then we'll bring Jackson in and we'll have a delightful free-for-all. The Graecopithecus thing is some fossils that were found in Crete that look like they're kind of at the root of the hominids, dating back about 7 million years old, and that puts things not merely in Africa anymore, but also across the varying size moat of Europe. That broadens the concept of when the early hominids are developing and isn't exclusively an African phenomenon. Then rushing down into the Chinese finds, those are about 250,000 years ago. There we're down into at that cusp, as we've been seeing in newer material where they've been finding hominids in northern Africa and outside the normal range of Afar, which was the South African zone where it was thought human species had developed exclusively. And it turns out we got some stuff that are in that little cusp mode, not quite yet fully human, maybe in the teeth mode. Again, it's a lot of this based on teeth roots and stuff. We're not talking about full skeletons here. Needless to say, this has thrown the field into disarray, as at least some public press announcements go on. And of course, any throwing into disarray immediately gets creationists into a lather, because they're saying, all of what you have been told is wrong, and blah, 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 blah. But in fact, it's not quite that. And I put some links up to both of the technical papers and also to some of Bechly's posts so people can look up to see what he has to say. And what is interesting about Bechly is what he doesn't say, which is what the hell does he think happened with these things? To apply his design model to what was going on. Does he argue Australopithecines didn't exist, that bipedalism isn't coming up fairly early in the mix? And none of that data goes away. And all of what pops up about these press release of the month club shows that you find on New Science Findings is that you should let the dust settle for a while before becoming too pushy about it. Normally, I wouldn't have done a thing on something like this until you see how the science settles. But independent of whether or not Graecopithecus pans out as what they think it means, and independent of whether or not this Dali skull from China pans out as to what they think it means, and I suspect they probably will, but even if they don't, that's already out there go away. All of it still has to be accounted for in any functional explanatory model. And what we'll be seeing in the next decade, next years, next months, depending upon how quickly the learning curve goes, is this new information will be incorporated. We'll learn more. We'll expand our charts. We'll have to adjust some things. We'll push some of the dates back to accommodate larger bits, just as they're doing in terms of when humans arrived in the New World, fully human people. But was it 20,000 years ago, 15,000? Did they come by boat or multiple waves? The genetics are weighing in. We get a lot of that. And that's the scientific process. That's what's so fun. And it's fascinating to watch the non-thought that isn't going on over in the intelligent design camp. I don't know. I'm sure creationists will weigh in on it. You'll find Bodhi Hodge and Georgia Purdom weighing in at some point. You'll find articles and answers in Genesis and Institute for Creation Research, and you'll probably find David Kopej and all these others riffing off of some of this stuff, inevitably. But We'll see whether they do any better in their own framework, because supposedly all this stuff should be, what, 4,500 years ago during the flood? These animals were supposedly preserved. Anyway, there's my opening intro. And Jackson, you can weigh in on this subject matter, and from there.
Yeah, I think it'll be very interesting to see how Graecopithecus turns out. I mean, you know, the original paper talking about it was a fossil of potential hominin affinities. So I don't even think they haven't yet nailed it down as even being a hominin yet, have they?
Yeah, it's just kind of close. It's got, frankly, kind of transitional features.
Yeah. Mm.
In all of paleontology, whenever you've got these kind of node periods, when a new taxa is appearing, you find that there's this squishy zone as a penumbra around it. That was true of the switch into Homo erectus, and it's the same as you start switching into Neanderthal, and it's the same as when you start switching into human beings, that you start finding the more and more the paleontology goes on, the more you find these almosts that are hard to classify, and they get into little turf wars as to which peg they want to put it in. Because remember, the whole problem with systematics is that it's very rigorous, but it's also very restricting, because you got to put it on one side or the other. You got to label it something. And even today, if you read the descriptions, it's fair to say that Homo habilis, one of the first identified one in our genus, you could just as easily regard it as the most advanced of the Australopithecines. And so it's just, in some respect, an arbitrary convention, in the same way of how you classify Archaeopteryx or how you classify Therapsids or anything else, that in a binomial system, you got to peg it. And that gives you rigor and clarity, but at the same time makes you kind of overlook the fact that you've got squishy zone before you actually get to the fully identified thing. And we need more data on the field. It's going to be fun. First of all, we'll see whether or not the datings turn out to be accurate. The paleogeography is intricate to work out what was going on. We have to remember there were ice ages sliding along, and sea levels were different, and so what the biogeography of some of these zones were as to what animal was transferring from what spot to another, how big they were, and all of that, their biogeographical range. When you just have a blip on the scope initially, well, duh, you're going to have trouble figuring it out. They'll gradually piece together its environment. They'll piece together more stuff. They'll be digging around to see if they can find more fossil data on these things. And I am predicting that 5, 10, 15 years from now, it'll all be worked into the system. We'll understand more about it.
Right. Yeah. We were just looking at papers yesterday on reconstructing ancient environments using keystone species to understand what sort of environment was in an area at a certain time.
Yeah, paleogeography is just absolutely fascinating. But obviously, the farther back you go, it can be. But in the last, let's say the recent thing, like the last 300 million years, a fairly straightforward way of doing it, because especially when you get down into flowering plants and that sort of thing, where you have seeds and pollen and the like, you can tell a hell of a lot about stuff. And then throw in coprolites and other things to know what was eating what. When you start building up climate things, now some of the material that they can do with oxygen balances and ratios to tell something about what climate and temperature was. You can tell from that what it involves are all of the specific geological zones where there's almost always some geologist who that's their spot, and they're studying that particular region, and they can start building up the little fine-tuned stuff that then accumulates up the food chain of the various technical literature until you have people high up on it looking at lots of different people doing work on a whole region, to where they can start figuring out, well, wow, there must have been a mountain range over here, and we'll check with that geologist to find out about that, and therefore they can figure out what tectonic things were involving, and oh, well, that connects up with this particular uplift, and that, oh, well, that explains why that thing we're finding there, because there must have been a monsoon cycle going on in that particular area. And so all of these things gradually build up bit by bit by bit, to where for people in paleoclimate area, this is a really fun, exciting thing to work with. And you've got computer modeling, the same kinds of stuff that are done in climate modeling for climate change. change the parameters, and you can do climate modeling more and more for paleo environments where you have a different mix. And so it's an exciting little world to go on. And boy, it needs more and more stuff for the anti-evolutionists to be farther behind the curve of.
I mean, when you're that far behind the curve, are you really classified as behind the curve or just not on the map at that point?
Yeah, I use the analogy. They're so far behind the curve, they think they're on a straightaway. They don't realize that the curve they're behind is way down the road. In some cases, a century or more ahead of them in terms of the science data. And it's always fun then when you're doing source analysis on anti-evolution literature, figure out where on the landscape of the data field they are. And you probably spotted it with Andrew Snelling over in Creationism Land, how suddenly dated the material gets. And you're looking at stuff that's like sometimes the 19th century for Snelling, and hasn't there been work since? Why don't you do this with your wonderful creationism model and apply it to something? Good, show us how it works. But amazingly, that tends not to happen.
Yeah, there's the lecture, like the hour-long lecture or so that's like by Kent Hovind, 100 Reasons Evolution is Stupid, I think it's called, and it's like all the source, it's like the earliest source is from the 1980s, or the most recent source.
Yeah. And it's partly because Kent Hovind is a specialized case. Remember, he's a secondary redactor. He's a relatively ignorant, boobish one. He doesn't really read much of anything, even creationist literature. And essentially, he's just glommed on to stuff that he learned in the creationism of the 1970s and 80s when he was developing. And from that point on, he's basically riffing off of like internet stuff, relatively superficial. If you move up to the heavy hitters at Answers in Genesis and ICR, the ones that do footnotes, they're very selective about what they deal with. There's always that react to the current press release thing. Yeah. Which is why us discussing this thing now is rather relevant, because you know that the more prominent it gets, the more it's in the newspapers, the more likely it is that the anti-evolutionist is going to take a pot shot at it, because they've got to. So they can't allow anything to be responded to. It's kind of the counterpart of Donald Trump in tweet land. It's that they've got to hit back.
Well, yeah, and
so you will get that. But that means that they'll be putting themselves on the table of fact and making assertions that you can theoretically check. The more interesting ones will be down the road, and some of them will be the technical arguments that will be coming out. Intelligent design, up to anything at biocomplexity, which is the one and only intelligent design journal at the moment. We'll see. We're not holding our breath on it. But you will get stuff at Answers in Genesis Research Journal, I'm sure. They would be stupid if they don't. And there will be things where they'll be talking about all this new evidence for human evolution. Now, at the apologetic level, the stuff that's up at the website, it's always apocalyptic. Oh, this new science find completely undermines evolution. And it's always very, very absolutely certain. But read the fine print, folks. And what's fascinating about all of this stuff is all of this increasing information about the complexity, the thicket of human evolution. Doesn't surprise me. I mean, it's that old holdover of the old notions of evolution that was prevailing before you came along, but I remember it as a young folk, was the single species model. They really did think of human beings. The human beings were just the species that developed from Australopithecines to Homo erectus, and there was a big debate for a while how Homo habilis fit in the things. You had two different camps between Louis Leakey and Johansson as to about what was going on. Johansson tended to be farther ahead on the curve, and in part because he was younger. It's not true of the modern Leakeys. They've changed the viewpoint, but there was that time when they were really all pushed out of shape over the idea that there could be multiple hominid species surviving at the same time and coexisting. And boy, that was just, it was like brain fart. But Johansson was saying, no, this is not at all implausible. If you've got things that are living in different niches and they have different echo connections as to what they eat, or the like, you can even be in virtually the same area and they won't rub shoulders.
Oh, yeah. What was it? Paranthropus was in the same area as some Homo species. and so their but their dental topography was different, so they're feeding on different things, even though they're living in about the same area.
And what it's going to be, none of this should be a shocking surprise, especially once the DNA of Neanderthals came along the scene, and we found out that a couple percentage of the Eurasian and a few other outlier areas of DNA comes from Neanderthals. I'm European thing, so it's probable I've got some Neanderthal DNA knocking around in me to some degree or another, and ain't it wonderful? I'm a mongrel. Yay! But the thing is that we would expect that now with Demancey and these others that have been coming up, to where we realize how much gene flow has been going on inside of these various species over all of this time. This doesn't surprise me at all. We got a little comment from the idiot over there. The our Creos and their evolution is dying. The evidence against it is piling up. Scientists are jumping ship in droves. That's the trope, indeed. The idiot.
Name
that's
one scientist,
precisely.
you know.
Yeah.
That's what I like to ask them when they say that.
And that's exactly the approach you should take. If they say, oh, scientists are jumping the evolution ship in droves, you go, oh, gee, can you name some? Fair enough with the material. Hopefully, with the stuff that you have under your belt from Slam Dunk and also your own research, you should be pretty familiar with the cast of characters on that. So it won't be easy for them to toss off a name without you going, oh, you mean that person? Okay, let me tell you about that person.
I love doing that.
Oh yeah, I get it a lot on Twitter. I just love to.
Oh yeah, the guy who could, or he didn't quote. He made a reference to the selfish gene at me, and I said, "Oh, I read that book. Let's talk about it."
Let's talk about it. Yeah,
jump that topic.
Yeah, I get them. The one du jour, and it pops up from a variety of people. There'll be some who are older Earth creationists, and even younger Earth creationists will throw Darwin's doubt from Meyer at me.
Ugh.
And I of course hit back and excuse me, I've met Meyer. We had little jabbery conversations quite a few times while he was still here in Spokane, and I'm sure he would recognize me by sight if we bumped into one another. Whether or not he would run for the exit, I don't know. But at any rate, I'm familiar with him indeed, and of course I do source checking on him up the yin yang. And as I discovered in particular with his evolution, Explore Evolution book that he did with a whole bunch of collaborators, that book was just a mess. And Darwin's doubt also has its troubles. He's a deck stacker. He's a verbose deck stacker. And that's why you got to plow through an awful lot of footnotes and references to find out what he's leaving out. But ultimately, he leaves out stuff. And he makes a good apologetic case. He's very personable. He's about my same age. Very gentlemanly. He doesn't have a temper or anything like that. But he also tries to pull fast ones. The very first time I bumped into Steve Meyer was at the infamous 1998 Philip Johnson debate with and Kenneth
Miller.
Ken Miller, yeah, who was invited in as the shill evolutionist. And I didn't know a lot of the folks. I was there to see primarily Johnson, and there was one of the little sub-lectures that he didn't introduce himself. And he started talking, and then only later did I realize that, oh, that's Steve Meyer. Oh, that's who it is, because I've been reading some of your stuff. Anyway, partway through this thing, he was talking about Archaeopteryx, and he started tossing off oh, well, there's some suspicion that it was actually fraudulent, that it wasn't really a legitimate fossil. And I couldn't resist putting my hand up right away. And he stopped and says, yes, sir. It says, well, no, that's not true. That was debunked back in the 1980s. And he promptly backpedaled on it. He shriveled like a summer dandelion on that one. And which then raised the question, if you knew it was an illegitimate argument to use, why did you bring it up to begin with? And that was the problem, is that Steve, in some respects, like Dwayne Gish, will get away with what he can. And if you know enough about the information to catch him on it, you can then backpedal him. And then you can see whether or not there's any backpedal left. Now, you got a whole new generation of others that will be somewhat more formidable, because Meyer isn't that well versed. He's a philosophy degree. I mean, he's a petroleum geology background to some extent, but he's not really a published scientist. Frankly, somebody like Douglas Axe or Ann Gager have much better creds in this area. They've been published in regular journals, and they've got actual genetic degrees and the like, biology stuff. So they have actually more street cred to be formidable than Steve Meyer does. But yet, how many of the ones that are offering apologetics are really going to be going after the axe and gauger arguments rather than Steve Meyer? Because Meyer is a little more personable. He's done more videos and done great big books. They're big books. They've got a lot of things in them. And the volume is, of course, means truth.
The only thing Gauger ever did was stand against a fake background.
Oh, I'm willing to give her more than that, because Axe and Gauger have tried
talking about that
to do analyses. They've actually tried to do some experiments. They deck stack things as to what experiments they're going to do, and they're very cagey and careful about parsing their information. That's another matter. But they are trying in the same way. They're in the same counterpart of the baraminologists over the Eurasianism land, because those two are people trying. They're actually trying to apply their models and to explore stuff. Although in Axe and Gauger's thing, it's more just to draw the line in the sand, to say here and no farther for evolution, to put boundaries up. They're not really explaining a design argument. They're essentially doing more a God of the gaps rejectionism. So in that respect, the baraminologists are actually farther ahead, because they're trying their theory to something, or their hypothesis, and to actually kind of explain things. They don't do it, but at least they're trying.
Yeah, all they can do is try and fail again and again.
Yeah. So I'm hoping or expecting to see this new data to reinforce on the both the Chinese finds, to get back to the topic, and the Graecopithecus, that we'll be seeing more and more examples that the hominid line leading up to the formation of the first notable hominids that we're seeing in Africa are broader, and it's not just occurring there. And there was probably a lot of gene flow and complicated things where you've got convergence happening all over the yin-yang, and it'll all work up to where finally we know so much about all the mix that we're started saying, oh, that's why tool use appears here but not there first, because of the selection pressures that are relating to their particular environments and all the other kinds of stuff. And then the same thing going for all that wacky gene flow that's going on in that period, 2, 3, maybe even back to 400,000 years ago, in the Homo erectus lineage, and what's eventually going to turn into what we now more identify directly as archaic Homo sapiens. And that they'll be detecting more and more about some of the gene flows and haplotypes. A lot of it, that far back, you're beyond the range of DNA. So you're not going to be able to look at anything as relevant as you can for the Neanderthals, unless you can find some things going down in remnants. However, some of the morphology aspects that you can pop up when they start looking in, just as they've done for mouse teeth, it's not unreasonable to imagine that paleogenomics is going to be able to start working out a lot more about the whole range of hominid jaw and tooth eruption pattern systems. And that one way or the other is going to start connecting up more and more to see what kind of suites of things connect up with other haplotypes and that. So there's an awful lot of inferential work that can be done in the next decades of science that we're just starting to see the little tiptoes with these early findings, and none of which makes Australopithecines go away.
Right. I mean, it seems like a lot of the people who are talking about, I mean, on the evolution side, a lot of the people talking about Graecopithecus are really, most of them are the people who want the hominin origins to be in Eastern Europe or Southern Europe, I think it is. Yeah, it seems like they're talking about it a lot more than most anthropologists are. They're like, aha, this just gives us more fuel for the East Europe hominin evolution.
This has been a paleoanthropological nationalism, has been there from the get-go. Some were okay with stuff being somewhere else. Ernst Haeckel was a big pusher of an Asiatic origin for human beings. He wasn't from Asia. He just thought that was a logical place for it, whereas Darwin was much more focused on the African lineage of things. But then everybody else, superior Europeans. And so that was the motivation behind Piltdown, that we don't want to let those damn French and Germans to have their advances ahead of us. We need a proper Englishman to be ahead of them. And that desire to be on the playing field rather than to let the data just go where they are has always been an impetus in there. And you get, and don't forget the role of personality cliques and turf wars between various institutions, between paleoanthropologists and geneticists. You still get a little bit of infighting between the ones that are using mitochondrial DNA and genetic retro calculations to do datings of things versus the anthropological and paleontological bunch that are looking at it from their directions. And inevitably, it's like one of those duh things. Any gene measurement is going to be earlier than the fossils. I mean, it's going to be a long time before the little gene switches eventually lead to a morphological variation so distinct that you can spot it, even if you have a good fossil record, and then the luck of the draw as to what part of that fossil record you're catching a hold of. So the odds are you're going to be getting an example of the morphological version of it way later than the genetic switches that are starting to trigger the process. That's a duh.
Yeah, well, I don't know. England does have their questionable cheddar man, which is kind of interesting, but may or may not be, what is it, contaminated sample? May or may not be.
Well, and we get into the same thing. There's a variety of camps about what's going on in here in America. And when human beings are arriving, I personally suspect that human beings probably arrived in multiple ways. We've already got genetics to suggest 2 or 3 different main Asiatic things. But the idea that there were more mixtures that were going on, and it was happening over a longer period of time, and it involved boats. We know that the Mungo man and all the rest over in Australia, that human beings were paddling across considerable stretches of water 40, 50, 60,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So the idea that that can't be involved in the New World as well, some of which the data is going to be eradicated because sea levels have changed. Nobody's going out onto the ocean to look where the sea level was when the ice age was in play. The ice was blocking the path across the land, but the water was lower. So the land was now somewhere else, and the water area was somewhere else. And so where you would see the evidence of people coming along and having temporary inhabitants and fire use has been swept away probably by umpteen tidal waves and sea level changes and tsunamis and all the other things that have happened over the years. And it's hard to do underwater archaeology, duh, even where you know when to look. Will I be surprised to find that human beings were starting to bump into the New World as far back as 30,000 years ago? I wouldn't be. The big population shifts are occurring much more recently. We know things were spreading pretty rapidly by 15,000 years ago. And you got people all the way down in South America, at the tip of South America by that time. And so, but you know, a few thousand years, you don't actually have to be sprinting to spread out, especially if you're a nomadic people that are used to moving. But I'm expecting that bit by bit, more and more data comes in. There's also a bit of Native American objections, partly cultural, that indicate religion, that make it difficult to do some studies in a lot of these areas. The repatriation flap over Kennewick Man that dragged on for years and years and years, that I can understand and sympathize with their positions on it. At the same time, I'm a non-religious pro-science person, and I'm saying let the data be looked at, and then you can perform the rituals afterwards. But the laws are very complex in this area now, and you're going to have to work around them. But complicates the process. There was a certain desire to think that Kennewick Man, one of the reconstructions of Kennewick Man looked surprisingly like Patrick Stewart, for example. And so there was this notion that there were these Europeans wandering around. And the idea was not intrinsically implausible, that you could have had people coming over from the European side just as easily as from the Asiatic side. But we have the haplotypes of actual living Indians to work with, and it doesn't look like there's any of that genetic information knocking in. It's essentially Asiatic, and particularly with the groups in the Asiatic areas coming from what's now modern-day Siberia and that area. And now then you slam into some Native American creationism, where not all, but some Native American groups are insistent that they were created in situ. I think the Hopi and Navajo and others. And so they do not believe that their ancestors came over by some wandering over tens of thousands of years. It doesn't change the fact that they've been living here for tens of thousands of years. But it nonetheless conflicts with their ideology. And you have that little tiny branch of full-blown Native American creationism that Vinnie Deloria was representing. He just died a few years ago, and he intersects with Velikovsky, and there's a whole bunch of woo stuff that connects up on that thing. But science is done by human beings, and they have political issues, they have backgrounds, some of them have stupid racist views, some of them have just egalitarian science interests, some people have religious motivations, some people don't have religious motivations, and you're expecting that to go on uneventfully? No, it's going to be spicy, and that will occur in all these areas. But ultimately, the data will out.
Yeah, Fino points out,
go ahead.
said Joseph Smith's Lehigh, right, none of the data of the Native Americans crossing will confirm Joseph Smith's writings.
That was a fascinating example. For those who aren't up on it, and you can Google a lot of the background material, you got to hand it to the Mormons. They were confident. They were quite certain that genetics was going to bear them out. Because in the Book of Mormon, there are all these migrations of the lost tribes of Israel that landed, and essentially they're arguing that there are no Native Americans for all practical purposes, that they're all lost tribes of Israel.
Well, they kind of waffled on that after a while.
Well, yeah, there's that data again. But they were expecting to find definite Jewish haplotypes showing up in Native American DNA. And when they found nope, then there was a lot of egg on the face on there, and they suddenly had to, well, the tests really weren't valid after all. And that's exactly the same thing you get into. I think I mentioned in the old tip book about Anastasia, that there was if you remember the little lady that was claiming that she was actually the Princess Anastasia. And unfortunately, the poor old dear lived into the era of genetic testing. And they could literally dig up the remains of the ones at Ekaterinburg, for example, and do DNA tests on them, which they did. And also, you could tell from the various relatives from those mitochondrial DNA passing down through the matriarchal lineage who's related to who. And worse, not only were they able to confirm that the Anastasia of the real one died at Ekaterinburg along with the other czars, kids, but that when they did DNA analysis on the Polish person who everyone had long suspected she had been the relative of, the DNA confirmed that she was in fact. So, I mean, it was just a spectacular paternity suit that identified that, nope, she wasn't the Russian princess after all. She was from this Polish one that they had always suspected that she was from. And so the DNA moves on, and it makes a lot of theories just fall by the wayside. Sorry, let the chips fall where they may. But the role of the Mormon Church backpedaling on this one was particularly hilarious, and they can find ways of rationalizing around it because people with Tortucan minds can rationalize anything. We're about halfway through the shtick here. Let me put up my one world famous obligatory patrons and also plea for financial help. Let me put my screen sharing up on here. Bloop. And screen sharing. Bloop. And I would like to thank our patrons, Stephen and John and Direwolf and Eat and Yui and Mona and Hendril and Jen and Jody and Staggles and Alex and Totes Real and Paul, who have helped at the Patreon site. You can see the website down there at patreon.com/tip. And you can see the website, tortucan.wordpress.com. There's a shorter training wheel one for the HTML set that's just tortucan.com. I don't directly link to it because it's not updated I'm still clunking around on that level, but it's still got a lot of the information. But the full PDFs and stuff are up at the main site, along with links to everything else, the books and all the rest. And if you haven't got that put on your speed dial or your tab, why not? Because there's a lot of information there. I hope everyone is downloading the works, passing them around, commenting. Occasional creationists pop up in the comment sections, and I respond to them. But I'd like to see more of you people out there helping and coming along and saying hi. I'd like to use it theoretically as a framework for a anti-creationism science strike force network of knowledgeable people where they can exchange information effectively and alert people about stuff. And we can do that on other social media, Facebook and Twitter. And then I will note down at the bottom, if you have any funds to spare that you can throw at gofundme.com/DCGO, that's where I'm heavily dependent on volunteer support. And the $5 challenge, buy me a cup of tea, the equivalent of it, and get all of your friends to do the same if you think it's important. That's the sales pitch for the thing. I'm doing work. I'll stop sharing on the screen here. I'm doing work that no one's ever done before. Simply repeating all of the stuff that other people have done, which I try to draw upon all the clever things other people have done. That's one thing, but I'm also breaking new ground. I'm applying a source methods approach to documenting things at a level that no one had ever done before. Evolution Slam Dunk is an example of that. The book on the reptile-mammal transition, which Jackson has read. Give a brief summary of that for the audience so that they can hear other than my voice.
Well, his book, Evolution Slam Dunk, is an absolutely fantastic resource for understanding not only the reptile-mammal transition, which he lays out in its totality, but he also explains the underlying flaws with paleontology, which is his source methods approach, and shows all the data that creationists have to ignore to make their little proclamations about the data. It's a very wonderful book. I'd recommend it to everybody.
Yeah, you'll find it's available in ebook formats, Kindle, Nook, all of that, plus the print version. I'm an old print version person, and by the way, anybody out there that knows regular publishers or agents that might want to help to be able to get an illustrated second edition off the ground, I can certainly make use of that as well, because I have a whole stack of new material. And Christine Janis, the paleontologist, said that I should do an illustrated version, and I go, duh. I would have loved to have done that, but I had to rush it into production because I needed the money. And I did the best I could on the content part, but the idea of tracking down all the cute little pictures and the charts and stuff from things and wrestling with creationists, because some of the things I would want to put up are stuff that's in their works to show how stupid they are, and they might not want me to do that. Right? That we'd like to do. And at that point, it would be a full-blown resource that would work simultaneously for lay people and also for the technically minded. Someone was just asking, in fact, about whether or not the book was easily readable or by lay people, or did it have a lot of jargon in it? And Jackson, you can give a description of how readable it is.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think it was very readable. Yeah, I don't think there was a whole lot of jargon. I mean, the only bit that people might call jargon would be the names, which are of course necessary because you've got creationists who are using the names for their own nefarious purposes, and so it's very necessary to understand what the names are, what they're referring to, etc.
Yeah, I tried as best as I could to explain the physical things like pygidial glands and all these other kinds of stuff, so that people would have an idea what was going on if I was discussing some technical point. And so I wanted it to be a thing that would be available for anybody to follow up easily on their own. And so if you're a science geek, you can just fork out on it. Or you've got the generic thing, so that everyone will have a good idea about the various scientists involved and also the various creationists involved. And so I wanted to cover it, so if you come in it cold, knowing diddly squat about the creation evolution issue, you'll at least have the major players in hand, you'll know the sweep of stuff, You'll know a lot of the controversies that are involved, and you'll be able to see stuff where you can do follow-up on your own on it. So you can bridge it in a lot of different directions. It makes a perfect Christmas gift, don't you think? Put it under your tree or in your stocking if you have a very big stocking.
Oh yeah, it certainly helped me. I think about questions differently now, and I think about how to approach them differently now because of that book, because of the source methods approach. And so I'm much more focused on the primary.
It's in many ways the simplest notion in the world, but it's also the hardest. It's how do you know what you know? What sources do you rely on? How do you fact check them? That's the basics of reasoning, and that's what I learned in college, and that's how I applied it on this. I applied it in increasingly powerful examples as I was moving to the Troubles in Paradise project. The thing I did on punctuated equilibrium, as I pointed out at the site, the tip 1.3, was basically my training wheel dry run, where I had moved beyond what I had done in the original project, which was to delineate the kind of methods, processes I was seeing. I was spotting their over-reliance on secondary sources and their lack of imagination and all the rest. But then I ratcheted it up when I resumed the project in 2009 to realize I could do something no one had ever done before, which is take a spot topic that's really critical and not merely look at isolated instances, but all instances. So you literally would know every single person who had ever shot his mouth off about punctuated equilibrium. And then the first one then that I've applied to the full court press was on the reptile-mammal transition. So literally you know all the possible counter-arguments on it. And that means that you've got this heavy-duty case of macroevolution, and you know every possible counter-argument anybody could offer it. And you know why they're wrong. Well, that should make you more confident, because you won't have to say, oh, no macroevolution, what about the reptile-mammal transition? And just wait for them to try to bring up John Woodmarapp or somebody like that, you know, and just then drop the anvil. So anyway, there's a bit of a plug, the book. And for those of you who like novels, I've got a novel out there too. You can find links to that, but I won't be talking about that because that's Evolution Hour. So to return to our evolution issue, from a methods point of view, what everybody would be dealing with Graecopithecus and also the Chinese finds or anything is when a new blip of information comes on the scope, you're seeing how it's being dealt with. Is it in a regular science journal, or is it just something circulating that you've read online or somewhere? Try to ground it and find out what the original material is, and then keep an eye on it to see how well it wears. Are there criticisms to it? Does it start getting used and going, oh yeah, that's actually very, very good, and this connects up with all this other stuff? See who the players are, what work had they done previously, and what work are they continuing to do? The more you study those forensic details about the provenance of the argument, the more you'll understand the connections. And you won't be blindsided so easily on things. You'll know if there are areas that are controversial, if you'll know that there are certain scientists that have axes to grind. They have a particular case they've been making for years and years, and oh, it's them again. Or new scientists that are coming along that are coming into the field, and they're putting a fresh look on things. And you can get to eventually get a feel about the lay of that land. And then that means that when you're seeing the subject come up with anti-evolutionists, and it will, especially if it's very, very prominent, if it hits news media and television coverage and all of that, you're guaranteed to have responses on it. Instead of being able to respond with just kind of a harumph, you silly creationist, don't you want to pay attention to the evidence, you can be familiar with what the whole evidence is, and you can be more liable to spot stuff in their argument where they're leaving things out, because you'll know what they've left out. You'll know the context on things. It's the same way if somebody tries to come up and say the Civil War didn't happen, and you know a lot about the Civil War, you'll be able to start talking to them at a level that you can't if you didn't really know much about the Civil War except you've seen the movie Lincoln. And that makes
Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer.
Yes. Not even the Spielberg Lincoln. We'll go for the Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer, which was a hilariously stupid movie. Never saw it. Oh yeah, it's worth a watch just for the fun of it, because it's so hilariously audacious. They did enough. There was a whole series of these things. I think there was one, Pride and Prejudice and Vampires or something. I mean, there's a whole
Pride and Prejudice,
where they intermingle fiction or Victorian characters and supernatural elements. And it can be funky and hilarious if handled in its own way. It can be kind of droll and humorous in the same way that Dirk Gently's holistic detective agency is on BBC and that. And I love those kind of formats. But it doesn't ever excuse you from not knowing what the facts are. There was a thing, just the most recent episode of Neil deGrasse Tyson Star Talk on National Geographic channel was talking about this in relation to the arts, because they were he was talking with Salman Rushdie, and this was not really an area of expertise of his. He's deGrasse Tyson's not really a book reader in that sense. He's science fiction and that kind of stuff. He loves that. And so they were actually talking about some issues that I was going, oh boy, this is like old news to me. And that is, to what extent should people in the arts be aware of the sciences? And deGrasse Tyson would want you to be able to write a scientifically accurate story. You can write fantasies and other kinds of things, but you should be aware of that. And there was kind of a groans in some quarters about the idea that people with liberal arts degrees should be mandated to take some science courses. And this is an old bit that I knew way back when I was first coming into college in the early 70s. Two Cultures and a Second Look by C.P. Snow. Let me put the blurb up on that in the live chat, and so anybody can cover on there. C.P. Snow, Two Cultures and a Second Look. It was a work, I think it came out around 1960, if memory serves me. And he is a scientist who also loved the arts. And he said that you can't be an intellectually well-rounded person if you're not familiar with both of those things. You should know just as much of a general knowledge about Shakespeare and Beethoven and the Kama Sutra and Asian art and African culture, and also physics and paleontology and geology and astronomy and all the great accomplishments of human beings in all times and places. You can't know everything. But if you think you are a well-rounded person because you know Hamlet, but you don't know about relativity theory, then you're not actually a well-rounded person, because you've missed out on a gigantic chunk of what it means to have become an accomplished civilization. All of those things should be it. Every clever idea that was developed by anybody, anywhere in the history of our species is the common property of all people. That's my appropriationist argument. And every stupid idea and stupid thing ever done by any human beings in all the history of our species should be recognized as such, and you should know why they're stupid, and don't do that. And so that's the goal of being well-rounded and well-educated, is knowing things. Now, and what was ironic is that we've been along this road even before C.P. Snow. If you look at the artists in the early Romantic period, your Baudelaires and your, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of some of the main writers of that period, particularly in the French, that were just science groupies. A lot of them were very Goethe, just slightly earlier period, was quite a scientifically accomplished thinker, as well as being a novelist and writer. And you found an interesting crossover of disciplines that was going on in that period that we kind of tend to forget. Now we're coming back to that a little bit, where in a world in which you can be knowledgeable about both is okay. There's hilarious, fascinating examples of a rock musician who happens also to have a physics degree. And you have people that have a broader range of stuff. And you'll find it in the most fascinating of places. I mean, look at somebody like Seth MacFarlane, where you're going to be seeing references to the sciences, you're going to be seeing references to history and culture. You're going to find people name-dropping stuff in a lot of different contexts on that. Why you can't know a lot about it, about a lot of different things. I tend to bump into all of those areas because I don't think that I should have any less appreciation of the arts than I do of the sciences, or vice versa, because it all makes me a better person to know all of these extraordinary accomplishments. And when you look at somebody like Richard Feynman, or Einstein, others who just have this incredible polymathic love of all sorts of things. I think James Cameron would fall into that category in the arts, people who do things. So I think the more you know about the more that you can know about allows you to see connections and make inferences, and it improves your art. And the knowing of the art will improve the science because you can see how it connects up with things. There's a budding discipline of the neuroscience field that's looking into why we like music so much and what's going on in our heads when we do that. And so there's a direct intersection of a structure. And you see applied methods. I just happened to watch a thing just this morning that came out from a completely off-the-wall direction about somebody who's reconstructed what Greek music sounds like. In fact, it was Jerry Coyne. He linked to it. And they've done this fabulous bit of where there actually have been notations in early Greek culture about what notes were what. And they've been able to reconstruct and replicate a lot of ancient instruments, including the peculiar double flute that allows you to hit particularly unusual tones. And then when you look at the meter of their poetry, which was intended to be sung, and that tells you the rhythms they were using. And so they've been able to replicate a pretty good stab at what 4th and 5th century BC Greek music sounded like. And it reminds you a little bit about stuff that you hear in medieval music much, much later, and in Arabic music, and that stuff, the scales that are used, some of the harmonies that are used. It's fascinating stuff. And we learn more and more and more about so many different things. Oh, and Paranor just jumped in, says, hi, RJ all. Jackson pointed out in the side chat about the philosopher of science. Tell us about that, since you brought it up in the chat. Give us an explanation.
Oh, they were talking about, I think Duh mentioned, he said he hates when people act like science and philosophy are rivals. And I was saying, just agreeing, yeah, they're not. I actually got to speak at for the philosophy club at LSU one time, and I talked about the Aquinas 5 ways and I also interviewed for my channel a philosopher of science named Charles Pence, who actually worked.
Yes, I caught that one. It was a very good show.
Yeah, he actually worked in a lab. He said a number of years ago, because he's a philosopher of biology specifically. So he'd even worked in a biological lab with bacterium, I think, or something like that. But yeah, he's a very, very nice guy, very cool guy to talk to.
Yeah, I had to nod in sweetness because he mentioned Mahler's 10th Symphony, and I go, yeah, I know what that is. Yes, I love that. It's one of my favorites.
I asked him. It was at that time I was dealing with a lot of people who were throwing at me Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. And so I had to ask him about that. Yeah, and so he's like, yeah, that argument doesn't really have any bearing on much of anything.
That's a polite way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I asked him some other apologetic stuff, because the preachers who come to come to LSU and yell at people on the sidewalk, humorously enough, actually, I passed by a girl one time who I overheard her say, I feel like I get evangelized every time I go to the Union, which I thought was pretty funny. They have one guy in particular who runs the show, and he talks about logic. Like, he's always saying, "Oh, this is basic logic." Well, the problem is he doesn't understand basic logic, and so for his for some of his arguments, I decided to ask this guy who is an actual philosopher who would know about logic and whatnot. And he and he was basically saying, yeah, I have no idea where you'd get this argument. It makes no sense on any level.
Yeah, I know you were slow to get to the idea about philosophy, but we'll get you there eventually. That everybody has a philosophy, they just don't know it. Or they do, and recognize it. And I put a little reference into to my NOMO Revisited that I have at the TIP website, that philosophy ain't ever going away for its utility. Philosophy is what you need to figure out undecidable propositions. It is involved in all normative activities, all ises and oughts. That's the world of philosophy. And the moment you think you can't, oh, you don't need that, you can do science. Science can't get you to is and ought. Sorry. Science is absolutely useful, the ultimate toolkit for dealing with decidable propositions. But the moment you step across that line into normative, uh-oh, if you don't know you need philosophy here, oh boy, you are in the field of wolves and don't know it.
Yeah, he was a nice guy. He's someone I could probably interview again in the future, perhaps. I don't know. We'll see. I actually haven't sent a message to anyone for an interview in a while. I've just been cranking out my own videos. Of course, I can't
Well, we
really
got
do
a
it for the
busy
next
season
month.
here. You know, everybody is running amok in the holidays, and I'll probably miss one of my evolution hours if I'm still functional at the end of the month, and then bumping back over as we bump into 2018. We'll see how that year works out. But yeah, the philosophy angle about that comes in every scientific enterprise when you're talking about what it relates to bigger issues. And all the stuff to close the big circle, since we're about ready to get to the end of the hour here, on human evolution, the things about how our culture originated, how tool use developed and when, how did it interconnect with language, to what extent did earlier hominids have language and what form it is. We don't have any recordings, we don't have any way to figure that out, but yet we can find inferentially stuff and what's going on inside the noggin by what tools are made, what thought processes have to go into making tools. And there's a whole massive discipline area that's getting more and more interesting as people go out and recreate stuff. And you have to realize that, for example, when you're making tool flaking, you have to actually get to the stage to be successful at it. You have to envisage what's inside the stone. So, boop, at just the right spot to be able to shear it. Otherwise, you're just going to break it into smithereens. And to what extent that was done without language, or what extent that required language to explain that to the novice, is one of the ongoing fascinating issues in tool formation. And it's right at the knee-deep about what it means to be conscious and self-aware and culturally connected by mimetic systems. So everything that we deal with in this area is going to be bumping into some philosophy issues. And you may as well be aware of it and know what the turf is and what boundaries are what, so you're not thrown off by it and just going harumph, what you're bringing up Wittgenstein.
Yeah, there's I don't know. That's kind of one of the places where philosophy gets me a little bit. I'm still a little skittish when it comes to philosophy. I mean, I won't really engage much of. If someone's bringing up a philosophy argument to me, I'm probably not going to engage with them. But that's one of the things where philosophers were saying, you know, we'll never know about consciousness that can't be explained by science, and yet here we are knocking on the door. So
yeah, well, and it is true that the people who insist that consciousness can never be explained to be the people studying it, and they tend to leave that out. I mean, one of the things again that I'm measuring in the TIP project, that you've got the cognitive literature, and you can literally measure how much of it actually cited or not in anti-evolution apologetics and religious apologetics, and I can tell you not much, any percentage of it. And so that's giving us some clues about all of that. But the philosophy angle, some of the stuff, you could argue in some respects that all of philosophy is dealing with things that everybody deals with. What is there a meaning to life? What is the meaning of life? Why should I do this? Any of those whys and ises and oughts, those are philosophical issues. And you get a lot of ping pong matches back and forth between one camp and another. But it's not something that should be one where, well, if you do not have a philosophy degree, you cannot venture an opinion on this. Sometimes it's important to know the players involved, but even I can't keep Immanuel Kant straight from a lot of other philosophers in the area, because I don't necessarily need them to arrive at the conclusions that I do. But I'm perfectly happy to discuss them and bandy about their implications if people want to. But So the final take-home warning before I put up my little end logo is that philosophy, science, the arts are not alien pursuits of human beings. They're integral to what we are. And you want to connect up all the dots you can. You want to understand how things work together. And we're in a delightful time when we have lots and lots and lots of new data coming on the field. And even if you can't keep up with everything, if you can be far enough back in the meta picture to at least have a sense of where the cutting edges are, and hopefully we'll be doing that to help you as much as possible on the evolution hours, especially when people bring up questions. Crocus Squirrel brought up this particular topic, and that's why I'm dealing with it today. That it will put another blip on the scope of things that will have you sense about what the map of time is, and then you can start thrashing about what you think about it and the philosophy of it. So, I think that pretty much wraps things up. I'll put my logo up in a moment. Thank you, Jackson, for being with the show all the way through there from the wilds of Louisiana in the east.
Thanks for having me.
And I will put up my little screen sharing blurb here to put the wonderful little logo. And come on, where are you again? There we go. I apologize to all the youngins out there how fabulously inefficient I am in terms of all of my usage. Isn't this a cool little logo that Peter came up with for Tip? And he came up with the basic idea, and I added the suggestion that he should have the little atomic symbols up in the spots instead of just dots. I thought that was kind of a fun, steampunkish, a little bit of modern science because it mixes. Anyway, thank you very much for being today, listening, and spread the word about the project. And if you can throw some funds at GoFundMe and buy my books for Christmas, etc., and put under the tree, I would appreciate it. Thank you.